For great-looking T-shirts, hoodies, and sweatshirts, the TNT shop is now open at tntradio.live. Trish Wood on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Hi, everybody. This is Trish Wood, and we are back with Hour 2 of On the Fringe. I just spent a few minutes with Karen Hunt talking about world affairs, specifically Russia, Ukraine, and the possibility of nukes flying. Terrifying and not out of the realm of possibility anymore, thanks to the fools running the U.S. State Department. We did not get in any detail to the Nord Stream pipeline. So I just want to finish that up with this information for you. If you don't already know it, it's kind of interesting. So when it happened last week, you could see the footage bubbling up, the gas bubbling up from above the pipeline into the ocean there. And I did find in my Twitter account this amazing tweet from a Polish member of the European Union, whose name is Radek Sikorski, MEP, blue checkmark. So he must be real. And here's a picture. What you see is a picture of the gas bubbling up from the pipeline. And he says, "Thank you, USA." Thank you, USA, he says. So that's pretty clear, isn't it? I actually screenshotted it in case he might take it down later. And then the other thing that you may or may not know is that Joe Biden did say on February 7th of 2022 that he would end Nord Stream. It's on video. You can find it online. It's easy to find. He's saying it. And it's pretty definitive. He may have not have meant blowing it up, but he didn't say what he meant. So, gee. And then the third thing I just want to say about that is I'll say three things. WMD, Gulf of Tonkin, Kuwaiti incubator story. These were all false flags dreamed up by American spooks in order to create a casus belli to get the American body politic on board for wars they didn't actually want. Gulf of Tonkin was Vietnam. Obviously, WMD's was Iraq. And the Kuwaiti incubator story, which was actually broken by my old show, The Fifth Estate, up here in Canada, and they were working with Harper's Magazine out of New York, and they discovered that the story that they were using to try to get Americans so angry at the Iraqis was that they'd gone into a pediatric hospital in Kuwait and unplugged the incubators and let the babies die, these terrible, terrible Iraqi soldiers, right? So here's what it turned out to be. It turned out to be that the nurse who brought that story to this diplomatic body was the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington's daughter. It was totally cooked up, okay? So will we be saying in the future, WMD, Gulf of Tonkin, Kuwaiti incubators, Nord Stream? We may well be, because it's just as likely as not, maybe even more likely, that America blew this up. I will tell you, Putin does not have a reason for wanting to give away, by blowing up the pipeline, his own leverage. The pipeline was his leverage. If he wanted to stop the flow, he could have stopped the flow without blowing up his own infrastructure. So it makes no sense, right? Anyway, I just wanted to clarify that. Now we completely switch topics, but we're not actually, because the next topic, which is the collaboration between the tech businesses, big tech, social media, and government during COVID, right? Where smart people like Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff and the rest of the Great Barrington people who were right in the end, we know that now, were being pulled off of YouTube and kicked off of Twitter. Lots of people were, not just them. And it seems strange. Why would big tech be doing that? Well, now we know that there was some collaboration between them. We've seen emails suggesting that Tony Fauci had a bit of a vendetta against the Great Barrington people, and not for any scientific reasons he was talking about, by the way, in these emails. So it's important to understand what happened here. The idea that they wanted it to look like there was a consensus about the bad policies they were imposing on everybody. And I'm in Canada, but we were following suit. We were doing what Tony Fauci was saying because he had credibility with some people, not me, but some people. And the fact of the matter was, and please take this on board, there was no consensus. They just shut the other voices right down. Demonized them, attacked them, smeared them, all ad hominem, didn't take them on the basis of actual data and science, never. It was always personal attacks with the aid of big tech, who were censoring stories and putting, the warnings on them, or taking you off to some government agency to keep repeating their own propaganda. It was really very, very anti-science, and we cannot ever forget, and this is why this is such an important story. People died as a result of that censorship. There's no question about that now. They killed people, right? People who maybe wouldn't have taken the vaccine if they'd done a personal risk-benefit ratio, who died of a heart problem, people who died because of lockdowns, people who committed suicide, people who didn't get their cancer treatments, kids who, died as a result of not being in school. They were beaten to death by a parent. I mean, those things had real-world effects, and lots of good and esteemed people, credentialed people, were warning against them, but those voices were silenced. And so this brings us to Jenin Younes, who, as a lawyer, has taken on the project for the new Civil Liberties Alliance in Washington, D.C., of showing and proving that there was this collaboration. I would even call it a conspiracy, but maybe that's too strong of a word. It probably has a legal implication maybe we can't make, but certainly the collaboration between the science bureaucrats in Washington and big tech with their social media platforms. So here is Jenin Younes. Hi, Jenin.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm really good. Thank you. I haven't talked to you for like a year or something.
I was trying to remember. I think it's been a little bit over a year.
Yeah, and it feels like so much has changed. In those days, it was I was recalling our conversation because we were both sort of going, yeah, we used to be like card-carrying lefties, and now we can't be that because what's happening with COVID is exposing how dumb that is. And it was so we've come really far since then.
Yeah,
right?
we have. Yes, we have.
Yeah. So tell me about, I watched you on Unheard with Jay, and it was enlightening. Tell me why you are doing this lawsuit.
Well, I'm bringing this lawsuit, and actually I brought one before this on behalf of 3 Twitter users who are somewhat less well known than Jay and Martin, but had also been tweeting similar things critical of government COVID restrictions.
Were they scientists as well? Sorry, Jenin,
one of them. One of them is Mark Changizi. He's the lead plaintiff, so he's a cognitive theoretical scientist. The other 2 are lawyers.
Okay.
I became aware that the government was involved in big tech censorship and was involved as too not a strong enough word, that it was the government was sort of behind big tech censorship, that it was pressuring the companies to censor people who have different viewpoints than from the government on COVID. And that's a First Amendment violation because, most people are aware that under the First Amendment, the government cannot censor people or enact laws or punish people for expressing views that it doesn't like. But, a lot of people thought that the censorship is private companies doing this. And that's sort of a separate question as to whether that's okay. I think there are very valid arguments that even that wouldn't be okay because of this. They're sort of a public square, but that's separate. But when it turned out that the government was involved, now the government can't use private companies to effectuate its own aims to do things that it can't do directly. That's a First Amendment violation. And so that's why I'm bringing this suit.
Okay, that's interesting. Both suits. And I guess the issue is that in these kind of cases, and it always has been for me as sort of an old school journalist, is that once you start censoring people, it requires that there is a person making the decisions about who should be censored. And we can't ever really trust a single person or a single body to make those decisions. Well, we've seen we can't. They've proven it, haven't they?
Right. That's exactly right. And, that I think these cases illustrate why we have a First Amendment, and I think all of my plaintiffs, everything they've said is very defensible. They don't say things like the vaccine has a microchip or anything like that. But you should be able to voice those views too, because as you say, who is to decide what the truth is and who gets to be heard and silenced? And I think a lot of people have this idea that there's this government composed of brilliant people out there, that can make these decisions. But as we've all seen, it turns out they're just people like the rest of us who seem oftentimes to get it more wrong than the average person, actually. So this case sort of shows why we don't have government censorship.
Yeah, and you know what? It's interesting too that the longer, we kind of roll through this crisis, the more it is revealed that people who were saying things that seemed strange, like I remember Byron Bridle, who I did have on the show because he was absolutely credentialed enough to make the charges he was making, and he was an honorable guy, and he didn't have any kind of ulterior motive, right? So I checked him. I didn't just book him, but his theory was that the spike protein was not staying in the muscle in the vaccine, and it was traveling throughout the body. It could cause trouble. So that's perfectly reasonable. He was attacked and deplatformed, and oh God, there was a fake website made about him, and so it was just like awful. And now with the breast milk story it just came out a couple of weeks ago, that that lactating women are being advised now not to get the vaccine if they're going to be breastfeeding because the spike protein is traveling around. I mean, it's like a lot of the people who were censored turned out to be right, didn't they?
That's absolutely correct. And I think about, all of the things that have changed throughout history. I mean, even in my lifetime, when I was a kid, margarine was the healthy thing. Fat was terrible. Now we know, you're supposed to eat fat. And the idea that, we have a scientific consensus and that's the science, as Anthony Fauci says, is absurd at any given point in time. All we have, at any moment is the best guess or the best hypothesis based on everything that we know and everybody's opinions. But but we get to the truth through a process, and a lot, if not most of what we know now turns out to be true, turns out to be false down the road. So the idea that you can, just shut people up when they have different ideas, or that's a good thing to do, is highly problematic.
Yeah, it's interesting too that you brought up margarine, because the other place where they were telling us completely falsely that the science was settled was around the food pyramid. Remember at the top, or at the bottom, the stuff you were supposed to eat the most of was potatoes and bread. That was the best thing, and right, and you should keep all the low carb stuff, just a tiny amount of meat, and it's completely inverted now. They're saying that, and we should be eating fat. I also believe that and it took them. I don't even know if they're actually convinced now that they were wrong, but certainly we know anybody who follows food science knows that they were wrong. But that went on for 30 years, didn't it?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So let's talk about who are the people in your view who were most involved. Let's talk about Tony Fauci first, because he's caught in some emails, isn't he? Actually giving advice and instructions. Yeah.
Yeah. So, not so much from what we got. So we actually got discovery in this case, in the Missouri case, the second case with Bhattacharya and Kuhldorf. So that means that the judge has ordered the government defendants, and actually the tech companies who aren't defendants, but as third parties, to turn over communications they've had between each other and some other information to answer some questions. It's called answer interrogatories. So through that discovery, we actually haven't seen that much from Fauci himself. We do know that he and Mark Zuckerberg had a lot of phone calls, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. But we don't know the contents. But we do know from a previous FOIA request, actually, that AIER made, that Fauci and Francis Collins, also of the NIH, had orchestrated a takedown of the Great Barrington Declaration and the authors. Now, that wasn't really, frankly, while morally I completely disagree with it, that wasn't really a First Amendment violation, because government officials can have an opinion and they can, decide that they want to slander scientists in the media if they want to, which is what they did.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, yeah, I guess that's protected to some degree. Although it probably shouldn't be, but,
I mean, I think it's horrible behavior, but and it may be problematic for other reasons, but it's not a First Amendment violation.
Yeah. See, I love discovery. I love when there's a court case because I know we're going to get to the good stuff, regardless of what happens in the courtroom once they have to start handing this stuff over. So have you started receiving discovery yet?
Yes, we have. So we've gotten a couple batches, and we have about over 15,000 pages at this point. So what we learned from this is that it's a really massive censorship campaign, far greater than anybody knew. We know right now about 11 agencies that were involved. There may be more, and about 100 government officials. And what they were doing is they were, for years, communicating with the tech companies, telling them what sort of material is considered misinformation, what they should take down, giving them examples of posts that they thought should be taken down, and asking for removal of specific posts. And even in a few cases, there are individuals who are named who they tell the tech companies should be removed from social media.
Well, was Alex Berenson one of them?
Yeah. So, and he probably has the strongest right now, I would say the strongest First Amendment claim of any American, even though I think all Americans' First Amendment rights have been violated by this. But for people who don't know, he's sort of a longtime lockdown skeptic, one of the original ones. He had a very active Twitter account, and he had been assured by executives at Twitter that he was in no danger of losing his account. He hadn't violated any policies. Shortly after he was singled out by Fauci, just a couple days later, and as a danger for saying that not everyone needs to get the vaccine, especially young people. Yeah. And then the same day that Biden said the companies were killing people by not censoring, misinformers, he was removed from Twitter suddenly, forever, permanently lost his account. So he brought a lawsuit. And through his lawsuit, he got discovered, and he was suing Twitter, not the government, alleging that Twitter had basically breached its contract with him. And he got the discovery, and Twitter employees were communicating internally and saying, we had a tough meeting with the White House. They had questions about why Alex Berenson wasn't kicked off. Mercifully, we had answers. And then it's very shortly thereafter that he was removed from Twitter.
Wow, that's amazing that I don't know why they've been meeting. I mean, I suppose just, to put a good face on it, not that they deserve it because they've been pretty mean to people, but are these just, in your view, just kind of young people? I'm not talking about the Zuckerbergs, but the people who maybe are signing off on some of these documents. Are they just young people who feel they're being public spirited by towing the government's party line on the best public health measures during COVID? Is that, or is it more political, or what do you think it is?
There's a lot of different things. So I think like those actually sounded like young, sort of naive people, I think, who think they're doing good work. A lot of it is, I think, you get this real sort of impression that these people think that they're a lot smarter than us, that they know what's best for us, that we sort of need to be managed like children. It's a very condescending attitude towards the public, I think, in a way that really rubbed me the wrong way. Now, it's sort of important to note that from a First Amendment perspective, this is very novel and new territory because of the nature of social media, right? Like we're sort of using similar things in the past, but there's nothing that really directly bears on it because it's so different. So, we're alleging that the tech companies were doing this because they felt pressured and coerced. They were really doing this under duress. They didn't want to, which is a very clear First Amendment case. Some people might argue that if the companies wanted to do this and they were coordinating with the government to sort of accomplish mutual aims, because they're all Democrats. I mean, they are mostly Democrats.
Yes.
And they share the same views. That's okay. That private companies can do what the government, they can work with the government if that's what they choose to do, and that doesn't make it a First Amendment issue. I strongly disagree with that. I don't think that's a proper interpretation of the First Amendment, but those are sort of the two different theories. And I think it's really important to remember that, members of the administration had been making these public threats saying that the companies would be held accountable for people's deaths, that they threatened them with regulation if they didn't do more to censor.
Yes.
So the companies can't be seen in that atmosphere as acting on their own.
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk more about that because I want to ask you how this is different, if it is different than the Hunter Biden laptop story, which drove me mad for quite a few months. So this is TNT Radio. I'm Trish Wood. I'm with Jenin Younes talking about her lawsuit involving the government collaborating with big tech to censor voices on COVID. So we will be back in a moment.
TNT Radio's Joseph Arthur.
Philadelphia law enforcement is investigating after a mob ransacked a Wawa store Saturday, causing residents alarm. I watched the tape of this event actually last night. Compared to other things we've seen this year, it wasn't the scariest thing by a long way. Mainly kids being completely out of control and going all Lord of the Flies on a Wawa. But it was mad. It was crazy and full of chaos, and it made me sad for the state of our world and the state of America. I was sitting there on the couch watching it thinking, for some reason, this makes me really sad. I don't know why. People have learned that they don't need to respect the law and the order it provides, and they have been told that they are the victims of society and that their rage is justified. And in a time when for them to elevate their station has become a distant dream, harder and harder to imagine ever achieving. It made me sad because this chaos was orchestrated by an agenda of chaos, and certainly won't be the last we see of episodes like this. It made me sad because it's not the country or the world I want my daughter to grow up in. And it made me sad because I know that chaos of this kind can easily escalate and will escalate into something much darker.
Joseph Arthur and his Technicolor Dreamcast on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
What I know about courage, I learned from my adoptive mom. She said sometimes you just gotta hold on and know we'll get through this. Mom, we are so high up. Hold my hand.
No, you hold my hand.
Here we go.
Learn about adopting a teen from foster care. You can't imagine the reward. Visit adoptuskids.org to find out more.
I learned patience from my adoptive dad. All he had to say was,
"Hey, you got this. Just breathe." Hey, we're pretty good.
yeah,
Might have to start a band.
I got it.
Learn about adopting a teen from foster care. You can't imagine the reward. Visit adoptuskids.org to find out more. This message is brought to you by Adopt US Kids, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the Ad Council.
Telling the truth is the only mandate we believe in. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Trish Wood here on The Fringe with Jenin Younes. I just wanted to say that at TNT Radio, We Never Go Home, we're committed to bringing you our take on the biggest topics of our time. We broadcast live 24/7, online, globally, no matter what. We've got you covered on TNT Radio. So we're just talking about the motivations of why government bureaucrats like Tony Fauci and others would be communicating with big tech and asking them to censor. And on one hand, I guess these are sort of, some of them are young people who just think they're doing a public service because they're not thinking the right way about how important uncensored information is, especially during a pandemic. But the rest of it, we were talking about whether it was political or not. Did it meet an end for a guy, like the Zuckerberg, who is the head of Facebook and obviously a Democrat? Was he doing their bidding because he is a Democrat? Janine.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I wasn't sure if I wanted an answer.
I'm sorry. I should have put that as a question. Sorry.
No worries at all. Yeah. I mean, it is, I think, as I think there's some of both going on. And then, I mean, but it is important to note too, that a lot of the companies weren't doing much censorship prior to sort of fall of 2020. Like, there was a little bit here and there, but it was mostly only like hate speech and stuff like that. It was really, when the Biden administration took over, there was a lot more. There was some going on in the fall of 2020, but that was mostly coming just from the CDC and DHS, actually, as it turns out, which is newer information. So I do think there is something to this coercion concept, that the real reason they're doing it is because they're afraid of regulation.
Why do you think that? That's maybe the response, obviously, of big tech. But why do you think the government was doing it? I sort of, in my head, I was thinking, well, of course they were doing it, but it's ridiculous they were doing it. Why were they doing it?
The government? Well,
why were they asking for that? Yeah.
My impression, friend, gosh, I've read so many of these emails at this point. I think they really believe in what they're doing. I actually think that they believe they're right. There is one answer, and that the appropriate thing to do is to silence people. I think they do think that misinformation is killing people, and so it's justified to silence people who dissent on various COVID-related topics and other matters. Actually, you mentioned the Hunter Biden laptop. That's actually part of the Missouri lawsuit that Jay and Martin are in.
A part of it in what way?
So the lawsuit actually alleges that the government was suppressing or silencing people who aired different perspectives on several topics. So COVID is one. The Hunter Biden laptop is another. The election, the 2020 election, the
legitimacy.
Climate. Yeah. Climate and even abortion, I think. Our plaintiffs are, so the lawsuit is brought by the attorneys general of Missouri and Louisiana on behalf of their citizens. And then we joined the lawsuit on behalf of the private plaintiffs. So that's Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Kulldorff, the two great Barrington co-authors. And then Aaron Cariotti, who is a psychiatrist, and Jill Hines, who runs an organization called Health Freedom Louisiana. So we're representing them, and our plaintiffs are only alleging that they were censored because of their statements about COVID, but other people are alleging censorship on these other topics as well.
So I'll come back to this in a minute, but I do want to talk to you a bit about some of your other work, because you were litigating mandates too for a while, weren't you?
That's right. Yeah, vaccine mandates. Then some of those cases are still on appeal, actually, so they're not over.
Really? Yeah. Did you have, I know in Canada, lawyers who took those cases to court did not do well. I mean, there seemed to be, and I think Jay even was an expert witness in some of them, but there seemed to be a reluctance for the courts here to go against what public health was saying, even if public health might be wrong. It is kind of a weird, community standard mindset or something. Did you find that existed in the States as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was really the case. So there have been some successes, but there have been more successes recently. And I think it goes to show how judges are really just people and they get swept up in the hysteria like everybody else. And if they're scared and they say the CDC says everyone should get the vaccine, then they'll uphold the mandate. And that's really what we found was judges were unwilling to find that if the CDC said something that the government can't do that, or an employer can't order that.
See, this really showed me how helpless we are in a way, because up here, the government of the province I live in, which is Ontario, we had some of the longest lockdowns and school closures in the world, was handed over to our public health people. Who are, they have a medical degree and a degree in public health, and they think very linearly. It was all about suppressing the virus, no matter what harm they did elsewhere. And so we were running around saying, how do we stop this? We've been abandoned by our elected body, namely the premier of the province, who he was up at the cottage the whole time, just letting the public health people run it. And so, and I was saying at the beginning, the courts will sort us out. We'll get a couple of good, and they didn't. And I thought, failing the courts, and given that there was no election it feels like there's a failure of democracy around these kind of public health issues. If there's wrong, I don't know what the remedy is then, if judges are prepared to defer to public health people who are making a mistake.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think what we saw over the past couple of years is really disturbing because we saw that failure. So at the beginning, I was a public defender in New York. I was not doing this kind of work when COVID first happened. I was wondering why nobody was bringing lawsuits challenging various COVID restrictions like lockdowns or the idea that you have to die alone. And when I started talking to some lawyers the ones I'm working with now, they said, you don't really want to bring these lawsuits in the middle of a public hysteria, because what happens is the judges get swept up in it too, and then you create bad law. And then, it's better to live with this for a year or two, bring the lawsuits later when everyone's calmed down, and then make good law. And then that's sort of the longer view. But under that theory, we all just have to put up with having our liberties violated for years if at any time a mass hysteria hits.
Yeah, this seems like a big hole in the whole sort of democracy project for me that's been opened, or at least it's always been there, I guess, but was certainly exposed by living through COVID. And all people really could do was go to the streets and protest, but the media didn't really cover that anyway. So I think that's why some of us, are quite traumatized by it, because, I got to do the podcast. That's great. You've got to do some really interesting law work. That's great. I'm sure that's kept you sane. But I still have a fair bit of impotent rage about the fact that there did not seem to be a lever anywhere in this process that the citizenry could pull and say, wait a minute, we really feel you guys don't know what you're doing.
Right. And one of the things I've reflected on these ideas a lot. The media really failed, the mainstream media, as much as I don't really like to use that term. And I think that's really the biggest thing. They didn't ask tough questions. They didn't challenge the narrative. They didn't challenge Anthony Fauci. The New York Times, which most people I know read pretty religiously, never aired different perspectives. They only printed things about the Great Barrington Declaration that were basically slandering the authors and saying they're Koch funded. This was really a horrible failure. And then the interesting thing about that, of course, is people like me and many other people turn to Twitter, turn to social media to get alternative information, alternative views. But then, of course, turns out they're then silencing people who share those perspectives. So it's a kind of disturbing time we're living in. And I hope what comes out of it is that people start to see what went wrong, and we learn some lessons and maybe put some protections in place so this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, well, that's where Twitter is where I first saw you, right? You had that nice little Twitter account there, Lefty Lockdown something. It was really cool. Yeah. Yeah. But just getting back to that idea, I guess, you always want, or at least I always see that if there is some kind of a crisis or a constitutional crisis or a democratic crisis, that there's always a way. And I think you nail it when you said that the media is to blame, because they were complicit in all of it. And as a journalist watching, having to passively watch them make a mess of it, and still to this day not admitting that they were wrong. You're right. Sometimes I say on the show, everything wrong in the world is because the media is not working properly the way they're supposed to. And I feel that's true, even more today than like 2 years ago. Yeah,
I agree with you. And this case actually sort of showed me, in a way, I learned something I hadn't known before. I think to some extent I assumed that the media covers topics that they should be covering. Maybe not in the way I want, but at least they're talking about it. But this story was not really picked up by most mainstream media. So, a little bit on the right. The Wall Street Journal wrote one article about it. The National Review wrote one article about it. But it's really been ignored. And this is about a shocking coordinated government-driven censorship of top scientists who had different views. This is a really shocking story, not to mention all Americans who had different views or who expressed views that the government didn't like. This should be something that everybody knows about, but almost nobody has heard of it. And so, when I hear people talk again and again about how awful Trump is and his supporters don't care about democracy, I'm like, well, look at the people in the White House now. They also don't care about democracy.
Yeah, right. I know. And it's interesting because I didn't know so much about this either. And I was glad to find you on Unheard, because it sort of gave me a pretty good idea about what's going on with the lawsuit. But I think in a larger sense, what still troubles me about all of it, Jenin, is the idea that, Jay is a really good person. Martin is a really good person. Sunetra is a really good person. Marty McCary's, like, all the heretics seem to be pretty good people. And it almost seems like it's a requirement, if you're going to be a bit of a COVID heretic, that you are a good person, because you're sticking your neck out for the good of humanity, and they're very likely going to chop your head off, So I think that the fact that they are more humane generally may be a kind of a character marker of some of these people.
I think that's right. I noticed that too. I was like, Jay, Martin, and Sinatra, who I actually met about 2 years ago. The Great Barrington weekend was the anniversary is October 4th, I think. They're some of the most humble, kind, but intelligent, just brilliant people, but no ego. All three of them. And I was like, this can't be a coincidence. They're all, some of the best people I've ever met. And watching them get slandered, accused of being Coke funded, accused of being the opposite of what I know they are. And I'm fairly good friends at this point with Jay and Martin. Is very hard to watch, and by people who I know are not very good people.
Yeah, I know. It does seem that the people who were speaking out had this. I mean, I remember my first interviews with Martin and Jay right after the GBD dropped, and how baffled they were. There was the pushback from Stanford and the attack on Scott Atlas. They were really quite confused by it, as was I, because what's interesting, I know you know this by now, but that the attacks on the heretics were never based on science. They never said, well, what about this study? Or that it was always, they want to let the virus rip, or, they're fringe, or whatever, right? And this whole period of time around COVID is characterized by a total lack of scientific debate on the subjects that were quite, were debatable, right? The attacks on these people were they never said you're wrong because of this data, ever. They never said that. No, it was a lot of name calling, deeming them eugenicists, and I think that was Greg Gonsalves said that. It's and then the funding thing. The people, they do it to me too. They're obsessed with this. You're Coke funded. The Great Barrington Declaration is Coke funded. I'm Coke funded. It's a very weird and bizarre accusation. And then there's a lot of guilt by association. So, you went on Tucker Carlson's show, so that, obviously you're a crazy right winger and everything you say must not be right. Things like that. So it's because they're wrong. So they can't actually win on the facts. And so this is how they go about it. Well, it's quite funny because on a number of topics now, Tucker has been, a brave leader, including some of the trans extremism that's now driving me a bit nuts. But he was right about more stuff than not. And saying, you've been on Tucker it's kind of a badge of honor now, actually. And they're just, right? That's right. All these lefty feminists going on because of the trans stuff with kids. Yeah. I mean, they're saying strange bedfellows, but if conservative men are now the natural allies of feminist, it's nuts, but that's what's happening, right?
I know.
I know, it's pretty. What a funny dinner party we would all have, huh?
I know. Yeah. We'll have to try to do it sometime.
We'll have to try to do it. Yeah. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about the lawsuit. So what is the timing of it, and what are you trying to get out of it? I understand it's not a monetary thing. So what are you trying to achieve?
Yeah. So the timing is, you can never really predict with these things. We're in the preliminary injunction phase. So it's, that's an emergency motion, basically saying that our clients are suffering, irreparable harm, or they're suffering constitutional violations. And there's no way that, unless an immediate stop is put to this, they will be harmed in an irreparable way. So it can't be fixed. But a violation of your First Amendment rights is irreparable. So we're in that phase. I imagine the judge will rule on that motion soon. So it was very rare for a judge to order discovery at the preliminary injunction stage, but he did. So that should, but the lawsuit could frankly drag on for years, and there'll definitely be an appeal. Either party will appeal. I think there's a good chance it'll end up in the Supreme Court at some point. So it could be frankly like 4 years till this is fully resolved. What we want,
but if they win, what do they want? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. What we want is a court, and ideally the Supreme Court, to say that the tech companies and the government cannot work together to censor people based on their perspectives, that's a First Amendment violation. That, if the tech companies are doing this, even if they want to be doing this, that they're sort of government actors and they're acting as arms of the state, and that's a First Amendment violation. So I would like to see it, as either way, whether it's coercion or coordination or both, that's a First Amendment violation.
Wow, that's so interesting. And do you believe it will be in the Supreme Court? And if it does go to the Supreme Court and then you win it, what happens as a result of that victory, right? Does it become some kind of entrenched law then that people can refer to, Bhattacharya, Kuldorf et al. Against so-and-so and make a case?
Yeah.
Or
the case is actually...
Yeah,
so the case is sort of more boringly named Missouri versus Biden. There are a lot of Missouri versus Bidens, actually. But yeah, that's what, it would become precedent. And I think it's really important that does happen, because if it doesn't, then I think we're in a world where the government and tech companies can work together. And it's basically fascism. In my opinion.
But if you win it, and I know it's not money for them, but is there anything punitive for the tech companies or anything punitive for the government, or is it just law? You're just creating law?
Yeah, it's just law. So it's very hard to get any kind of compensation in these cases. I think, so someone like Alex Berenson, he settled his case, but I believe he got a fair amount of money, but that's because he had a very specific he was able to show that he specifically was targeted, and he was one of the, rare people who could show that he was financially harmed. I think you'd have to be able to show that you were financially harmed, not just that your First Amendment rights were violated in order to get money. Or to get sort of compensation. So I don't see that happening. I think it's a precedent is what we want.
Yeah, I know with Alex that he, he's back on Twitter now. And I guess he's kind of untouchable, right? He can say whatever he wants now. They can't.
It's interesting. So my understanding is that part of the deal was he gets back on Twitter and they can't kick him off. So he's actually been tweeting things that people who get kicked off tweeted or want to tweet, which I think is kind of cool.
Well, it is sort of cool, unless you're one of the people who gets kicked off. Like I got a 24-hour suspension. And here's what the tweet was about. I did a show with a woman who worked as a journalist at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation here. She'd been there for many, many years. And she quit the CBC over its handling of COVID-19, over its inability to make any criticism of vaccines, the repeating of these mantras, safe and effective, safe and effective. Yeah. And she tried to do some stories, and they were running the stories through this group of people. And you couldn't, and they actually were saying we can't criticize the vaccine because it might cause vaccine hesitancy, and any rational person says, well, yeah, if you're telling the truth and it makes people vaccine hesitant, they probably should be vaccine hesitant then, right? Like it's like this weird kind of loop. Anyway, so she, I interviewed her, and it was a big show, obviously. She resigned from the CBC, and she gave us an exclusive interview and kind of blew the lid off what was going on in the newsroom. It was very, very instructive to hear the inside story of what was happening. So I put out a little tweet, and it just said, something about, I named her, and her name's Marianne Cloack. And I said, she talks about the CBC's, support for the vaccine and lack of motivation to make any critical call or something like, really journalistic, right? And that's the one that got me kicked off. I mean, it was like so weird. I know. And I got kicked off like the week after Alex came back on and saying that we're all going to die from the vaccine, and I just did that. And I just said, here's what happened to her. And here's what she said. I wasn't making any declarative statements about the vaccine, and they got me, and it's a funny thing because it does make you think twice. It has the intended effect that you start kind of censoring yourself, right?
Right. Well, I do because I'm worried about losing my account. And that's actually what's known in First Amendment law as a chilling effect, when people
Yes.
are afraid to say things because they're afraid of the repercussions of doing so. And so you don't even have to show that you were actually censored. Like, one of our plaintiffs actually never had any, was never suspended, never had posts removed or anything. He's just alleging he's afraid to say things because of the chilling effect. So that alone can constitute an injury in these cases. And so that's why I said earlier that all Americans' First Amendment rights have been violated. So I think that's true because, first of all, the chilling effect is very broad and affects a lot of people. But you also, interestingly, there's a corollary to the First Amendment right to speak, and that's the First Amendment right to receive information. So we've all been deprived of hearing the views of those people who've been censored.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the other problem we have now, though, is that we have 2 tribes or maybe more, and people curate their social media feeds based on what they already believe. So, right. So people,
right.
I mean, people who believe in everything public health said on lockdowns and vaccines and masks and distancing and shutting down playgrounds and all that stuff, mostly still believe that. It's quite amazing. It's like they're hypnotized or something. It's hard. It's tough, right?
Yeah.
Do you know people like that in your life? Do you have friends or family like that?
Yeah, I do. And it's kind of, luckily it's easy. I mean, it's easier now to just not talk about it. But like last summer I went to San Francisco where my brother lives, and he and his wife are definitely on that team. And it was harder because, the masks were still going on, and they were worried about traveling because they were worried they'd get COVID on the plane and stuff like that. And so when people are talking about it, I find it harder to be part of the conversations. But at least now things come up less frequently.
Yeah, you have to kind of step back. Well, the problem with the discussions, I think, Jenin, too, is that it's not just, I don't agree with your interpretation, but there's a moral judgment made if you don't agree, right? It's like you're some irresponsible person who doesn't care about other people. If you're not wearing a mask.
Well,
that's how it...
Yeah. Sorry.
No, you go ahead, Jenin, please.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, that's been, from the very beginning, that's how they shut people up. That's why I didn't say anything publicly for till about September of 2020. I mean, I had been saying them to, friends and my boyfriend at the time, but I was too scared to say it or to write anything because of that social pressure. And it was you're a bad person if you question for a second whether schools should be shut down. So I actually call that like social censorship. I don't know if that's the right term, but it's not legal. It's not the government doing it, but it's a way of suppressing debate. And it's very dangerous on its own.
Well, our prime minister did that. I wonder if anybody here is suing our prime minister because he really created a very, very, very toxic environment for unvaccinated people. He said some shocking things like we shouldn't even be tolerated and we're all racist and homophobic. And I mean, it was just, I actually couldn't, look, I think he's a bonehead. I could never understand how he got elected. I know we all have kind of a love affair with his father. Who is a very interesting guy and gave our kind of boring little Canada country a little bit of, joie de vivre. He was kind of a stylish international jet setter dude. He dated Barbara Streisand for a minute and a half. That stuff was all fun and we loved him. He was terribly smart if you disagreed with him. Justin has none of those qualities. There are some women who think he's good looking. I don't even think that. I just think he's sort of like in over his head, right? But he was saying terrible, terrible things that did very, very much penetrate through the country. And there is even a famous, if you Google Toronto Star anti-vax headline, you'll find people have screenshotted this cover. And it says, it had all these comments by Canadians about unvaxxed people saying, oh, I hope they all die. They shouldn't have hospital care. I don't care what happens to them. Cut off their medical. Just astonishing, awful hate speech. And it was generated by our prime minister. And I've often wondered, and we had this really wimpy opposition parties because everybody was afraid that if they stopped this and people died, they'd be accused. That was the Damocles sword, wasn't it? for
Right.
people in opposition and government. They didn't want to be the one to say, oh, we're not going to do lockdowns now. And then people die. And of course, the media would say you killed people. So they all went along with it.
Right.
They?
That's,
Right?
yep, that's exactly right. And yeah, Trudeau is really a monster. He and
He's a monster.
Newsom and
Yeah.
Yeah.
He and Newsom are the same. Like they are
Yeah.
bros, right? They are
And
totally.
Jacinda Ardern. There was a conversation on Twitter about who got the award for the worst worst leader of this era.
Well, Jacinda was bad because I hated her accent so much, which is not very nice. But I couldn't understand in part some of the things she was saying. You know, she was very compromised that way. But who did they say was the one?
Oh, I don't think there was ever a resolution. But there are so many to choose from.
Yeah, I actually think it might be Justin, and I'll tell you why. Because he didn't just do dumb things; he said things that can never really be taken back. And he started kind of his version of an apology tour last week with this. Now that we've finally dropped all the travel mandates. And ArriveCan, which is a nightmare of digital tracking. He said, I wasn't talking about everybody who didn't want the vax, just extreme people. He never said that. He was lumping everybody in.
Yeah.
So I think what he said eclipses Jacinda, eclipses even Bojo was kind of dumb. And obviously Newsom is a complete nightmare.
Yeah.
But I think he might win just because he was so mean about the unvaxxed,
Yeah. I think that's fair.
It was not good. So what's next with the plan around the? I know you said it could take 4 years, but is anything interesting going to happen in the meantime? Are you going to get any kind of discovery that you can come on the show and spill the beans about?
Yeah. Well, so we're getting more. We actually got more, but it's very new, and I have an agreement not to speak about it yet.
Okay.
And then so the judge sort of gave us limited discovery for this preliminary injunction phase. That shows you how much you can get, this 15,000 pages for the limited discovery. But when we move forward with the actual lawsuit, he specifically said in his order he was limiting it, but not for later stages. So we may very well get more. And what's happening is, we keep learning about more people and agencies who were involved in this. So we keep adding their names. We also want to see these people's emails and these people's. And one of the things we sort of learned, because the judge, in a rare move, ordered the third-party discovery, ordered the tech companies to turn stuff over, even though they're not defendants. We really saw that the government wasn't being forthcoming, because we had asked them for all the agencies that were involved in this censorship stuff, and they gave us, a few. And then it turned out through the emails the tech companies gave us, we learned that there were 11. So, that just shows us we can't really trust that the government is going to give us the real information.
Wow. And so this is maybe an unfair question, but what can be done about Tony Fauci? He looks like he's going to retire with the scads of money and a massive pension, and he's done so much damage, and he needs to be put under oath by a really good litigator and cross-examined by somebody who knows. I interviewed him many years ago, 30 years ago in his office, and he's a slippery guy. Yeah, it was a big accountability interview for a doc we were doing, and he's slippery. He doesn't like to be challenged. The interesting thing, if you called me and said, Trish, how do I handle Fauci on the stand in a cross-examination? His weakness is he does not like to be challenged, right? He's got a bad temper, and he's a very hubristic guy, and he can kind of lose it. And he's done it a bit with Rand Paul, right? You can see him kind of bright. He's bristling. So, but I sorry to sort of go on a tangent there, but I would like to see him punished. So what is there a way to see him punished?
I don't think so. I mean, I he's one of the people I would, I try not to be too vindictive, but some people I think deserve to really be punished for what they've done to people. But I don't see it happening. I mean, it's, first of all, in these lawsuits, you typically sue people in their official capacity, not their personal capacity. So if they're doing their job, they can't be held personally liable. You have to show that they were really doing something outside, really, really criminal almost, or something like that. I don't see that happening, but I guess it's possible. I just don't want to get my hopes up for anything like that. I have to sort of, I try to just come to terms with the fact he's probably going to have a nice life and tell himself he's a great person and die thinking he did the right thing for the country and the world when he caused so much harm.
Well, I think, at the end of the day, what might get him is the gain of function in the Wuhan, because at some point, everybody's going to have to face the fact that this was very likely lab created in a lab that was funded by Tony Fauci, who's lying about it, right?
Yes.
And I mean, I have no doubt the fur and cleavage site is a dead giveaway. Everybody says so. So at some point, maybe if the Republicans can pull their act together, and get elected, they could have some kind of a legal proceeding around that.
That's right. And I do think there's a little bit of hope for that. I just don't want to be too optimistic and then be disappointed. But I think it's one of the reasons that he was so scared at the beginning and took such an intense approach was, I think, because he knew there was bad stuff going on at that lab because he's been part responsible for it. And he didn't want people to find out, and that he did a lot of what he did along the way can be explained by that.
I totally agree. It's in Jeremy Farrar's book. If you haven't read it, you should, because what he says they were doing, it's really scary. They spent like 6 weeks with burner phones having secret meetings thinking they'd unleash this bedeviling gain of function virus on the world. It's very, very interesting. Anyway, Jenin, Younes, thank you so much. Keep on going. We do rely on smart people like you to shine a light on the things, since journalists aren't doing that. And we're very grateful for you. Well, trying to. Thanks, Jenin. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye. And that's the show for today. This is Trish Wood on The Fringe. I'm going to be going to the Free Speech and Medicine Conference, freespeechandmedicine.com.